Hello, Professor Hirshon. Thank you for coming on. For the audience that doesn't know you, please feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, George. My name is Nick Hirshon. I'm a former journalist in New York City. I was a reporter for the New York Daily News for 6 years, from about 2006 to 2011. I studied at the Columbia Journalism School and the Ohio University EW Scripps School of Journalism. And now I teach at William Patterson University in Wayne, New Jersey, about 20 miles west of New York City. I'm the founder and advisor of our campus chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists.
Awesome. And so, how did you get into this exactly? Like, what was the inspiration? What was the story?
Well, I think growing up, I saw the power of journalism, and it seemed very exciting to me. When I was a kid, my parents would always be getting all the daily newspapers. We got the big New York Times supplement on Sunday. We were getting Newsday or the Daily News or the Post every single day, listening to news radio all the time. And so I started to really appreciate the power that the press has on folks, the need to stay informed, the fact that we're all living very busy lives. So we just don't have the time to get all this information ourselves. So we rely on reporters. And those are the folks who do a lot of hard work and have to often work at times when we're taken off, holidays, weekends, nights. And I feel like all of that kind of spoke to me as this is kind of a public service. You know, both of my parents were public servants in government, but I felt this is a different type of public service. And now I feel in teaching obviously has another public service element to it where you're educating the journalists of tomorrow, in my case. So that's why it all was very exciting to me.
So, when it came to your parents, you mentioned just now that they were public servants governmentally. What were their jobs?
My mother worked for the Social Security Administration, and that's where she met my dad, who then went on to become an accountant at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. And he hopped around a few different government jobs for New York State's Attorney General's office. And I think for both of them, even though a much different kind of a career than journalism, right? They weren't necessarily getting news out or anything like that, but it's more that you're serving people. You feel that there's a higher calling to what you're doing. And so there may be days when you are exhausted and you're just not feeling it. You're not motivated to do this work. And yet you kind of appreciate that there are people who are counting on you. And you might be in a position to do something that nobody else can do right now. And I think that's what makes it so rewarding.
Right. Yeah. And journalism, especially in recent times, has definitely changed how it looks. Right. It's not the same as it used to be. It's also, it's been respected differently. There's been different points where it's had different varying levels of respect. Some could say it's decreased. Um, there's one journalist in particular, actually. Funny enough, he's from Jersey too. Yeah, are you familiar with James O'Keefe?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, like, what are your thoughts on someone like him, like guerrilla journalism?
Well, I feel like, for me, journalism is mostly about adhering to truth and accuracy. And also, uh, when I was growing up and going through journalism school, a lot of it was built upon being objective, not revealing any side that you might have on something. Um, I felt, I tried to adhere to that, but then as I've grown up more and kind of followed a lot of the debates about this, the truth is probably that we all have some sort of a bias, a prejudice. It could just be a life experience. It's not prejudice necessarily in the negative connotation we think about it of hating a certain group of people or something that strong, but more just because of my interests or yours, we might be attracted to certain types of journalism and certain kinds of stories that we want to tell. Obviously I got a hockey jersey behind me. So if someone came to me with like a hockey related story, I'd be more interested in it. And I think where that falls into what you're talking about is, honestly, a lot of the people who I think are masquerading as journalists do not always, reveal what their true motives are, or they go about it in kind of nefarious sorts of ways. They're not necessarily driven to help the public and to inform the public, but more to either make a name for themselves or to promote a political agenda that they already adhere to. And so they are co-opting journalistic techniques, investigative techniques that are usually used maybe to try to find somebody who is, doing something really truly bad, um, and maybe applying it to folks who don't really deserve that kind of a treatment, or that you could go about it in a more traditional way of asking straightforward questions of them.
Right. You feel that it's a little bit invasive and not correct.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And that's something that I've kind of debated with myself of because I see his videos all the time. They're kind of impossible to miss. And some of them, and they go around everywhere because, they're political figures usually. Right. So, I'll always see one of his videos and, it'll be maybe an intern or whatever saying something that, they wouldn't say in public necessarily on the news. And I think about that and I'm like, on one hand, one could argue that he's like exposing something kind of corrupt, but on the other hand, I'm like, is that really right to put a person and their job and their position and everything at risk because in private they're going to say something like, less appealing that they wouldn't say in public about their boss, for example, and that's to some extent it's a very gray area for me, right? So I don't know what your thoughts on like that point would be.
Well, when I teach journalism ethics, we usually talk about the rare circumstances in which a journalist should, for example, misidentify themselves or not reveal who they are, hide a camera on themselves, or a microphone, all that. And it's usually only in a situation where, number one, you can't get that information in a more traditional way. Because often, if you just ask those people questions, or maybe you've got to ask people around them and you got to get public documents, but you can get there without having to resort to those kinds of measures. And also that the information that you're trying to get is of overwhelming public importance. There's investigative things. I used to see this a lot growing up, and I'm sure they still do it on a lot of TV stations. But like local TV stations might find out that the local grocery store, for example, is selling rotten food. And in order to out them and get some really good TV journalism, a little bit of that gotcha journalism, they will go out there with cameras and they will show you, like, we went in there and we looked at them changing the dates on the meat to make it look like it actually expires next week instead of today. And we heard them laughing about it and being callous about it. And in that case, if you were to expose that, that is directly impacting people's health. It is calling out people who are clearly doing something objectively wrong, and in a lot of cases know it or bragging about it. And that's something that, in those situations, I think we want to, to call them out and to show that. In other situations, it really should be a last resort. I tell students during my time as a reporter, I never resorted to that sort of stuff. I mean, it's not something that's very common. It's not like maybe because of those kinds of videos that you're talking about, people might get the idea that, oh, this is what journalists do like all the time. This is the average thing. And it's not. It's something that I feel is a very, infrequent kind of a thing that journalists end up doing only after a lot of consultation with lawyers and with editors, and just thinking about, what is the really, like, carefully reflecting on, is this the best way to do this?
Right, yeah, and I mean, he's not, James is not the only one that does this, right? There's many, many websites that kind of encourage it, that say, "Here's how you do it," and and again, the main thing that gets it with me is the fact that a lot of these people, like, they're going on kind of like a date. Usually, that's kind of the I guess the misidentification of yourself. They go on a date, and you're with this person. And they're asking like, "Oh, questions about your job." But what I find highly to be problematic in those circumstances, even if sometimes if it does expose some of the minor levels of corruption, or, maybe someone admitting to something that they normally wouldn't, which might be of public importance, very big problem is that these are not people that are, very high up that can really change these things. These are not necessarily people that can make these decisions, right? A lot of times, very like low level people, right, that really can't influence anything, and they're just kind of talking about what they observe. It's different if it's like, you know, I don't know. I'm just going to use an extreme example. If it was Obama and he was saying, "Yeah, during my administration, I did this," and he's joking about like assassinating someone, that's a little bit different, you know. Like, what were your thoughts on like something like that would be like on my point to that?
Right. I mean, I think that, to your point, there's a difference between a CEO, uh, a high level politician, or any politician, really. I feel like there are certain positions where people open themselves up to that kind of public scrutiny. If you're running for elected office, you're getting taxpayer money, you are supposed to be representing people and their best interests. And if then you are lying about that, I mean, that's what journalists are supposed to find out, if you're not revealing everything. And like you say, there's a difference between that. And I'm not completely familiar with every video that you're talking about, so I can't really speak to them individually. But generally, if you're going for someone lower level, like you say, is that meeting the standard of newsworthiness? Because what an average person says, who might work for a politician but is kind of an inconsequential cog in their overall operation, what their opinion is, or they might just be speaking out of turn. They might be saying things to try to brag, to make themselves look bigger than they are. They might not have access to the information that they are pretending that they do. So, I think that as a journalist, that's where you also got to be careful of, like, is this person trying to play me a little bit? Or are they trying to, maybe convince me that they're a big shot? And that's where, but of course, like you say, there are people who, journalists, take pleasure in covering lies that people tell, and when people misuse public funds and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's the bread and butter of reporting. uh, I think there's also like different ways of doing it, right? There's, again, the gotcha, like, sort of a style, and then there is more of a, we're going to ask you these kinds of questions, and we tell people in advance and all that. So I just think, honestly, for your generation and for the generation that I'm teaching, that's one of the concerns, is that we want you to, I feel like journalism professors in general, or teachers, would want you to know that's a style that has been co-opted by others, that doesn't necessarily reflect what journalism should be, and that the main goal isn't about embarrassing or humiliating anybody. It's supposed to be about representing the best interests of your audience. And sometimes they converge, and sometimes it's like, yeah, I'm going to call it, like you say, the president of the United States did something wrong. And, and if it means that we got to go undercover to do something, like, okay. But I just think that those choices should be made with a lot of sensitivity, and a lot of forethought, instead of it being like a regular practice.
Yeah, I mean, like I kind of get this sometimes where people consider technically what I'm doing as a form of journalism, right? As the podcast, like I've interviewed, former head of the New Jersey FBI, for example, multiple FBI agents, CIA agents, whatever, former Navy SEALs, and these are public servants, right? These are people that, sometimes that know things, that are talking out of experience, and sometimes talking about problems in leadership and pointing out specific people, right? A prime example would be when I had former head of New Jersey FBI, and he was talking about Chris Christie and these various cases that he's dealt with where, proper justice wasn't served, where he felt that political leaders had gone away with, like, whatever, things like that. But I wouldn't privately record him on a phone call, like, saying that, right? Because there's no, for me, like, number one, he can only do so much, right? Number two, he only knows so much. Even if he was the head of the whole investigative operation, like, you know, I it doesn't mean anything to me to get him on a private recording and just be like, oh, look at what this guy said in private, when you could have gotten the same result from a public interview in many cases, right? Or by considering them as an anonymous source. A major problem that I have with a lot of these videos is that they, even though I do understand the point and I do have to some extent a form of respect for it, because it is exposing some important things, another problem is that they're not anonymous, and that there's a lot of that their names and faces are shown, and sometimes their profiles on Instagram, they're tagged. It becomes more of a public shaming thing when it's like that. Those people don't really have anything to do with it, or not as much as the public will be led to believe. Sometimes it's just an intern, sometimes it's just a an agent or an employee. Other times, yes, they can legitimately make decisions, and there's no reason to brag about some of the things they do. But I don't see, to some extent, I see like a lot of problems with it, and it's a little bit more flawed than I think the immediate reaction to it would be.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that uh, that's of everything. Unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, but I'd say unfortunately, right now we're in an era where there's an overload of media coverage, and a lot of it is free and it's overwhelming. Right, every day we're getting hit with all of these social media posts, podcasts, streaming services, news websites. There's just so much of it, and to expect an audience to have to actually wade through all of that and make sense of it is not necessarily what people have time to do. The average person is not going to have time to research, and that's what's the problem. I feel if you just watch one of those videos quickly on Instagram for 30 seconds, uh, and then you move on to something else. But now in your mind, you're thinking that what you heard on that video is necessarily true and the right way to go about things. Um, and that's just damaging. And as you also described, for some of the people who are targeted in some of those videos, this could end up like hurting them for the rest of their lives. And maybe, again, they may not always be doing the best things or saying the right things, but who among us doesn't make mistakes sometimes and kind of should expect that a private conversation is private? Because imagine, for you or any of your listeners, viewers, if everything you ever said in private, everything in a social media DM or a text message or a conversation you were having with a friend or a relative, if everything of that was like put out there, you'd probably be horrified, right, at some of those things. And some of it's out of context, and some of it's when you weren't in your best shape, and all that. And so I think that's just one thing that journalists have to consider, is we're not out to get people, we're out to help the public. And again, sometimes those overlap, but not maybe as frequently or in the style that you're describing.
Right, yeah. And we have plenty of people that have, you know, I guess in your case the overlap of the gone after but also serving the public, right? And the importance of journalism, right? Tiffany Fung Jones, I think the woman's name. Um I might be bringing her on for the podcast at some point. I don't know yet, but she was one of the journalists who investigated Sam Bankman-Fried, who, with the crypto exchange. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
she was talking about what he was like in person, and that's a very good form of journalism, right? Of talking about what he was really like, proving the fact that this was a scam. Or there's a YouTuber named CoffeeZilla, for example, that I'm a fan of, who actively goes out of his way. Are you familiar with him?
No.
Well, he goes out of his way to investigate scams, like celebrity scams, like gurus, quote unquote, and all this. And usually it works out pretty well in the end for him, and like in his journalism. And I think that's a very fair thing to do. But at what point is a public person true, like, to be, I guess, to be looked at with such scrutiny, right? Like, to the point of like private conversations are allowed to, like, in our case, like, at what point do we consider it to be of necessary use to the public?
Right. Again, that should be the primary focus all the time, is how is our audience served by this content? Some of it might have entertainment value. It's interesting to watch somebody being called out on a lie, whether or not they really lied. We don't really know all the context. It is fun to devour that kind of content, but it doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that that should be the vast majority of our media diet either, because that also feels a little bit like these are the things that might be kind of exciting for us to watch from time to time, but it's like having, the diet that you eat. if you only have the junk food all the time, that's going to be an issue. And that's kind of what that feels like to me sometimes, of like, in doses for the right stories, sure. For it to be the main thing that, unfortunately, I think, like they're saying, a lot of folks of your generation watching YouTube videos, media, social influencers, and some of these other sorts of things that go around. If that's like the majority or the only way that you're getting information, and you're not also trying to read a newspaper here or there, whether that's in print or online, or watch a more traditional television broadcast, or go into more legacy media, I think that exposing yourself to all of those things is generally a good idea if you are media literate. And this is one of the topics we discuss a lot in journalism school, and there are courses in news literacy to try to introduce you to all of these different kind of sources and how they're evaluated, and what does a blue check mark mean these days on X. It's different than what it used to. And Instagram, now you can pay for the blue check, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you are legitimate or that you are some verified influencer. It just may mean that you are paying $15 a month to get subscribed to this service. And a lot of people who spew misinformation and propaganda could pay $15 a month to do it. So that's, I think, the overall kind of issue that we face. But, generally, I've always said, as long as I've been teaching, for people to consume all of this stuff, just be healthily skeptical about it, right? Check other sources. When you were talking before about, you may interview somebody for your podcast and they say something that sounds bizarre, and or whatever it is, or something that sounds outrageous, you could follow up on that and go into a public document and see if that public document confirms what they said, or if there's something else that kind of helps round that out, so you're not relying solely on one person.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that topic, there have been many recent events in journalism, one in particular, Tucker Carlson, who very recently did an interview with Vladimir Putin, right? And in my opinion, I think that was a very good thing and a very important thing to do, because it brings both sides to the argument, right? And it's also something that's very valuable of information of what he thinks and what his thoughts are. Whether or not they're what he really thinks, I don't know. But, you know, I I'm a big fan of, going out and interviewing anybody, right? Of like political leaders, whoever. So what are your thoughts on, I guess, my standpoint of, I think that's the right thing to do, to interview anybody, like political leaders especially. I think they're important.
I think with certain people, and Vladimir Putin is one of them, the media has to be careful about giving them a platform or a megaphone to get a message of hate or deception further than they otherwise would. And so, on the one hand, I certainly agree with you that we can benefit from an interview with anybody. Just hearing them talk, we might learn something about their mindset. Even if they end up lying in the interview, there could be something gleaned from that. On the other hand, I think that if that's not done carefully, the journalist or the interviewer can sometimes fall prey to someone trying to spew misinformation. And unwittingly, or sometimes wittingly, depending on who the interviewer is, they are helping to spread that. They're giving it some legitimacy, because they're saying, if a dictator is speaking just on social media, well, it's kind of understood they put it out themselves. It was their people. If they're speaking to a journalist, for the public, that might legitimize the context of the conversation. And, it might make the average person watching say, well, they're speaking to somebody who I see a lot on TV and who I've heard of. And so I guess this is credible, in some way. And maybe the interviewer is not really challenging them as much on some of these points. And I think that's what's also problematic with sometimes interviewing folks like Vladimir Putin, right? Is that, does the interviewer even feel comfortable asking tough questions, when we know that in a lot of cases, dictators might not just bristle at the questions and get angry at you, because that could happen anywhere, but take it out on you. Um, and so I think that that's, when we see journalists getting imprisoned or killed for what they're reporting, um, you know, I just think about, if you or I were to interview somebody like that, how much would we be thinking about, I've got to stay true to what I need to get from my audience versus I'm also fearful for my physical health right now. And if I say the wrong thing, or if I challenge this person I'm interviewing on a certain point, I don't know what's going to happen to me. And I think that that's a very scary reality. So, that's a very complex topic. And there are people who've studied those kinds of interviews and those kinds of dictatorships and, political situations a lot more than I have. But I would just say that that's like kind of like on the one hand, yeah, I like hearing from people of diverse backgrounds. Sometimes it can be done in a damaging way overall, and that might not be the best route.
Right, yeah. And actually, on the tough questions part, right? There was kind of a famous interview. It went viral for this one part where not one part, I guess this was the entire interview, where a woman, it was for 60 minutes, I believe. She sits down with Donald Trump, and the first thing she says to him is, "Are you ready for some tough questions?" And Donald, Mr. Trump, former president, whatever, he gets upset at her. Not like and some people say he was right for this. A lot of people say he was right for this, which was the fact that he found it rude that she immediately said to him as the first thing when she sits down for an interview, "Are you ready for some tough questions?" Like, you can't be that interrogative. And regardless of his politics, I do think that's kind of a wrong way to go about it, to immediately sit down and say, "Are you ready to be basically interrogated?" Right? That's no way a journalist should go about it. Immediately he walked out afterwards. He's like, "Oh, you don't like." He's like, "You don't say this to other people. Like, why are you doing this to me?" And he's like, "I think we got enough of an interview," and then he leaves. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
Oh yeah,
yeah,
that was Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes. And then he came back and did the interview, as I recall. Right, so they still got the interview. I think there's a few factors that are going on in that kind of a situation, and one is for TV journalism. A lot of it is built on drama, cutting clips that you can then use in TV commercials, you can use on social media. So I'm imagining if, let's say, you're watching TV and a commercial comes on that says, like, that you could see like Leslie Stahl saying, "Are you ready for some tough questions?" And then Donald Trump like reacting and says, like, "Bring it," or whatever. That's a great, very short, like 10-second way or less, 5-second way of pulling you in. I'm like, oh man, she's going to ask him some tough questions. I better tune in on Sunday night because this is going to be a great interview. And so there's some of TV journalism and all journalism that is, quite frankly, manufactured at times, theatrical. But then, as you're pointing out, it converges with basic journalistic principles and sensitivities and decorum, right? To not like just throw someone under the bus, or to ask somebody an unexpectedly tough question that they don't deserve or whatever. So I think that's all part of the the glamour side of journalism, the celebrity journalism. Remember, again, journalists today, some of them are celebrities. Leslie Stahl is a celebrity. She is a well-known person. And a lot of the people who are on TV or the radio, especially, but even, newspaper reporters, whatever, they become at least well recognized in their community. If they've been reporting on national politics, they, might get noticed on the street. And some of that is because they are good at creating those kinds of sound bites. So I think it's, how do we as journalists resist the urge to have those quick sound bites that, they sound really good. They're great for advertising a show, but are they journalistically sound? Is it really about the true journalism? And can you just ask a good question, ask President Trump a good question in that scenario, and then get a good answer, and then use a clip of that for your promo. So, I don't know exactly what her mindset there. I'm not saying that's what she was going for. I could see those kinds of dynamics playing out, and that being yeah, a problem in journalism.
Right. Well, if it was for me, for example, if I were to say something like that, I would explain to them kind of like how I did with you, with the, please introduce yourself part, where, you know, it's a basic thing that I kind of do with everybody. So, but when it comes to something like, are you ready for some tough questions? I would likely explain to him first, and that's probably what she should have done, if that was her plan with the promo, the clips, because maybe it's possible, or she was just that was just her first thought, and there was no forethought to it.
Or
But
maybe she was just trying to be coy and like teasing and like, in a kind
right,
of way that a lot of reporters act with sources, and just more like, I mean, like reporters and sources always have a kind of, depending on the source, but political reporters, you might have a little bit of a love hate or an adversarial relationship at times. And, you're covering things that they don't always want you to cover. And, you're covering their opponents and you're asking them, your opponent says this, and how come you said one thing and did another? So, like, the candidates are not going to always love that. And sometimes I think journalists are trying to break the ice a little by maybe throwing something like that out there. You ready for some tough questions with a smile, and not thinking that it's going to rub someone the wrong way. But it's it's just like you're pointing out. I think also again this sensitivity that we have to have, that we're now in an age where things are often misinterpreted. They could be taken out of a context, or just someone might not derive the same meaning from something as you intended. And so, how do journalists compensate for that and make sure that when they're presenting themselves, they're doing it in a way that serves all audiences? It's tough. I do not envy the journalists doing the kind of work that Leslie Stahl was trying to do there. Donald Trump is a notoriously difficult interview. Uh, he can talk over the interviewer. He debates them. He might call them out on things and say they're unfair. And so you're kind of in a defensive mode of, or maybe you're thinking, I got to go on offense a little bit at the start to kind of set him back on his heels and prevent some of that. So I get to the core of some really good interview, but there's no one way to do it. There's no specific right. But it's it's a complicated thing that you've described.
right. Well, with me, my mindset is I'm open to doing an interview with anybody on any side. I'm kind of like I don't want to say an extreme, because there are some people I wouldn't interview for sure. Like, I was with Julian Dory and we were talking about this, and he's like a famous YouTuber, and he was saying, he's like, and I'm like, who wouldn't you have on the show? Like, is there anybody in public that's in the public eye, that you wouldn't have on the show? And he kind of jokingly, half jokingly said, he's like, well, I wouldn't have R. Kelly on the show. And he starts laughing. But, there also is like a truth to that, because we were talking about controversial figures and political figures. And I'm like, would you have this guy on? He's like, I'm not really interested in politics. But with me, I've interviewed people that have, met Joe Biden, met Donald Trump, met or Bill Clinton's bodyguard was somebody recently had on. Obama's bodyguard, I think, was and Jimmy Carter's bodyguard, like various of like these different people, like Navy SEALs that were hired to protect Obama, people that worked under him. Or most recently, someone that met Donald Trump. He's running for Congress. This guy, he met Donald Trump and asked him, like, what was that like? All the questions that you imagine. How did you guys meet? That was a very big one. How did you guys meet? I'm like, how did that work? And in every case, they all said good things, but I don't feel the need to, I guess, let my own beliefs or like overshadow the knowledge that I could get from that interview, or that people could get from that interview from the podcast, right? And it's not like an interest of my own politics, right? I try to get to the point and say, like, look, what do you think about this? Why do you think that? Right? Like, how does that benefit you, or something like that? But that's, I don't try to go into it with like, well, X statistic, like, I would just want to know what they will say, right, to the
Mhm.
most general questions sometimes, right, which is my perspective on it.
I think what journalists are trying to figure out is, how do you have a diversity of voices to represent all these different opinions while also understanding, and this is, I think, really critical to what you're talking about right now. Remember that journalists amplify voices in ways that give them credibility, let them reach a much larger audience than they otherwise might, and change public opinion in deep ways. So pretend that journalists just conduct interviews and we're just, on the background, and hey, you all make up your opinion and see what you say, like, but the very fact that we're conducting the interview with those folks sends a message to an audience of these are opinions that deserve to be heard. These are, opinions that maybe we're not going to challenge on this podcast or TV show, or and that could sometimes be dangerous. It can lead to, people who are disputing basic facts getting the same airtime as folks who are citing those facts. And I think that's where journalists have a responsibility to kind of gatekeep a little bit and say, not everybody deserves to have their time on air if they misinform and they're deceptive, and or if they're just propagating lies. So it's a tricky balance of wanting to hear from those perspectives. And again, I think the other thing to that is, if those people are going to be on a show, then being willing to challenge them at times, and not just think, well, I've got to be totally kind to them the entire time and deferential because they agreed to be on my show. I mean, you want to be polite, but I think there's also times where you've got to say, like, but sir or madam or whoever, you said this thing last year when you were running for office, and now you're in office and you didn't do it. And there are people who voted for you who are wondering, what's this about? Or you just disputed this fact, but actually I did research before this interview and I found out what you're saying is just not factual. This is what all these other sources say. And I think that's good journalism. Letting people ramble on about whatever they may be lying about, that's a big issue, because the audience doesn't always know that they're being lied to and doesn't have the time to figure it out themselves. And they're trusting you. And I think that's when the journalist breaches trust with the audience, because then the audience is like, wait, I heard this on George's show or Nick Hirshon's show, and now wait, it wasn't true, and the interviewer didn't say anything about it in real time. They're just expecting me to kind of, like, they're just feeding me lies and expecting me to fish through it. So I just say, consider that perspective, that it's noble to try to want to get all voices included, but some voices are so irresponsible and have such a poor record of spreading misinformation that they probably don't deserve that platform.
Right. And I do agree with you. My only counter would be that I think that there's some degree of responsibility to people that listen. It's going to be a little obvious, but like that they should question, but also not shoot the messenger. Because I remember a few years ago, Joe Rogan had he's had a few controversial guests, right? And people blame him and they call him right wing for that. Right. And to my point, and I've thought about this, I'm like, these are just people that Joe has had on a show. Is he friends with them? I don't know. Even if he was, just because you're friends with somebody does not mean you're going to agree with them on 100% of the things they say. You could just understand them. But, for someone like him, he's known for having sometimes a little bit controversial of guests, right? People that have challenged, certain scientific notions, people that have challenged certain public opinions. And people have looked at that and said, like, oh, that's, he's this right wing, he's a lunatic, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And, to my point though, you're right, he doesn't know what he's talking about, like he's not an expert on a lot of these things. But I think it is important though for some people to be heard, right? Because that's also a dangerous thing, to have people that are so bad that they can never be heard from and to have total disdain for them, because then the total opposite extreme happens, and then there's some people that never get heard from, right? They never get their sort of side of the story heard, and it's just this one narrative that's being told, right? Which can, if it's one story that's being told over and over again, it leads you to think like, well, who's benefiting off of this story, right? And in a very extreme example, again, Vladimir Putin, Russia and Ukraine. For the most part, most mainstream media, if not all of them, have only gone to Vladimir Zelensky and the Ukrainian side and the United States side because most media is from the West. So, what does it look like from the Russian perspective? That is an interesting and important thing to know as well. However, from Tucker's perspective, it's also hard to challenge him when he's in Moscow, in Russia, talking to the most powerful person in that country.
It's a dicey scenario. And so again, I think the impulse to say, I want to hear all sides of a story is generally correct. We want to try to collect everybody. Like you said, there's a story about what people in Russia think about Ukraine and what's happening. And there's definitely stories to be told there. Um, and it's all in, I think, the additional reporting, because what we haven't really gotten into as much is that it's not just about that interview, right? Again, if you have me on your show and I just start spewing misinformation about myself, I present myself to be better than I am, and just say, like, trust me, that's what it is, and you just release that episode, I think that that's a dereliction of duty from the journalist. Is like, you might say, well, Nick was on my show and this is what he said. Then after the episode, I looked up some of these things that he said. And he mentioned that he went to this university and got his, PhD there, and he really didn't. And he mentioned this other thing, and that never really happened. And, I think that builds trust with you. And it's just what journalists naturally do. So some of it is challenging during the interview. The other thing you can do, like in the case of the Tucker Carlson interview, or if you are no longer in the presence of that person and you don't feel the immediate threat anymore, you can then do research, acknowledge there's other sides of this, and if they made claims that are disputed, like, go to some of those other voices, cite some of that sort of stuff. It's so I think that's all part of what good journalists try to accomplish.
All right. And, I know you are on a bit of a tight schedule right now. It has been 40 minutes, or 42 actually. So I'm going to let you go, but I do appreciate you coming on the show and hearing your voice for a little bit.
Oh yeah, thanks a lot for talking to me, and some interesting topics that you're mulling over. And I'm just glad that you're thinking about them so critically, because honestly, I think that's the most important thing. Is you're taking in all this media like you're describing. Um, a lot of people just take it in and accept it and don't really think much more about it. The fact that you're asking questions and debating, which way do I go with this? How would I do this on my own show and apply it? I think that's a really smart way to go about it. And I hope that, as you continue to go through your career, that you'll have those. I think everybody needs to do that, no matter how long they've been in journalism or any field, right? You're always reassessing yourself, and you're always, contending with the issues of the day. So, So thanks for having me for this conversation. And it's always nice to talk to someone who is, informed and trying to learn more about the world.
I appreciate that. All right. Have a good one, man.
You too. Take care. Bye bye.
Be good.